Right. Good evening. So, for Parshas Toldos, if we can turn to the Chumash, in the Chumash, to starting on page 134, 135, is where Yitzchak invites his son Esav to receive the blessing. He says, "Go out, find some game, bring it back, and then." In this state of joy, of enjoying the delicious meal, Yitzchak will be inspired by prophecy, and he will hand over the blessings to Esav. Rivka overhears this, and so she goes to Yaakov and says, "You've got to do something, you have to step in." And Yaakov says, "Well, it sounds like a plan, except Yitzchak's going to know that it's me." So she prepares for him these goat skins, and puts them over his hand, and she prepares the food, and he comes in to Yitzchak. And there on page 137, the Torah tells us he came to his father and said, "Father," and Yitzchak already starts to feel that something is not right here, and says, "I'm here. Who are you, my son?" And Yaakov says to his father, I am Esav, your firstborn. I did whatever you told me to do. Now please, I beg of you," I'm adding a few words here, "sit up and eat so that your soul may bless me." And Yitzchak says to him, how'd you do this so quickly? And Yaakov says, "For Hashem, your God, made things happen." Yitzchak says to him, "Yeah, come here. Let me touch you. Let me feel you. Are you really my son Esav, or are you not?" And Yaakov comes close and he feels him, and he says, and that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Hakol kol Yaakov, v'hayadayim yidei Esav. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, but the hands are the hands of Esav. But he couldn't recognize him because his hands were really like the hands of Esav, and so he blessed him. And then he says, "Yeah, you're really Esav?" And he says, "I am." So he says, "Bring it close so that I may bless you." And he brought him food, and then he gave him the blessings. So Rashi, on the spot, and we're going to keep track of the Chumash here because we're going to come back to it. Rashi explains, what did he mean when he said the voice is the voice of Yaakov? He meant not so much the voice, as in the way that he sounded, but just the way that he was speaking. Rashi's language is Kol Yaakov shemedaber b'lashon tachnunim. He's using polite terms. Kumna, please. But Esav, when he walks in, just a few verses from now, he says, you can see that right there, a few psukim later, he walks in and says, Yakum Avi, get up, Dad, and eat my food. I want my blessing. Yitzchak says to him, "Who are you?" He says, "I am your son, your firstborn Esav." And Yitzchak trembles a great trembling. So you see that there's a difference in the way that they express themselves. Which is interesting, according to the way Rashi is reading, that Yitzchak, we have a whole debate at the beginning of the parasha why Yitzchak loves Esav more. So there are those who explain, and seemingly incorrectly according to Rashi, that Yitzchak was somehow naive, and was unaware, was fooled by Esav. And here you see that Yitzchak clearly understood that Yaakov is the polite, refined son, and Esav is the one who needs more help. And that's the approach that many of the commentaries take. That's why he loved him more, because he felt that Esav needed that extra care and attention, and that Yaakov would take care of himself, which is a beautiful way to read the parsha, and that would explain why Yitzchak wants to give the blessings to Esav. Yaakov will be fine. Yaakov will get his blessings directly from God, but Esav needs the help. The problem is that it seems that Esav might have been more lost than Yitzchak would have accounted for, And we find the Medrash tells us that even after Esav's passing, Yitzchak came to fight for Esav, and then God argues and defeats Yitzchak in a debate, and Yitzchak loses and Esav goes to Gehenna. But it's really a question of how far do you think that Esav fell? And you see that in Rashi, that already here, Yitzchak is saying, well, you're speaking way too nicely to me. You're treating me in a way, and we know Esav is renowned for his honor that he showed his father, and yet still it was expected that he would speak in a disrespectful way. That's the approach of Rashi, and if you take that approach of Rashi, you can read the entire parsha in a specific way, in a certain way. However, most other commentaries don't read it that way, that it wasn't the words are the words of Yaakov, but they actually translate Hakol Kol Yaakov as the voice. The actual voice, the voice recognition, was that of Esav's voice and not of Yaakov. So the question is, if he did recognize this as Yaakov's voice, then what's his doubt? It's Yaakov's voice, and therefore it's Yaakov. Why is he asking, who are you? And even allowing him the chance to suggest that he's Esav.
Because he had no reason to believe that anyone had overheard this conversation with Esav?
Right, but it's the voice of Yaakov. Assuming that if their voices are distinct enough, that, and you would expect that parents should know the difference between their children's voices. Yeah.
Sometimes siblings sound very much alike.
Okay, so we'll get to that in a minute, but let's give your first explanation first, which is that if you don't expect it, then you don't hear it. The problem is that you see he's suspicious. So it's not like he's in this state where you could just fool someone because that's who you're expecting. So the Rashbam, we've said he's one of the commentaries who likes to focus on the Pshat very much. The Rashbam says that in fact, Yaakov and Esav, as twins, had a similar voice, which is interesting because physically they seem to be different in so many ways. Yaakov is ish chalak, is smooth, and Esav is ish seir. He was hairy. He was born. Our sages tell us he was born covered in hair. So you see that there was this physical difference. Esav, according to the Midrashim, was ruddy. His hair was red, but even his skin, his whole tone was very red, and ruddy is the term they use, while Yaakov wasn't that way. So it's quite likely that it's very possible that should mean that there should be a difference in voice as well. Nevertheless, the Rashbam says that their voices were different, especially for parents who can easily tell the difference, just because there'll always be differences, but enough that Yitzchak should be fooled. That's what the Rashbam suggests. However, there's a question that may have bothered you, and it seems to bother school children more than it bothers adults. Sometimes kids ask the better questions than the adults. Has anyone here ever seen a goat? Yeah. Seen a goat? Have you ever petted a goat?
Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, so how hairy was Esav? Goat skins?
Are they more rough? Are they more rough than hairy? Would you say?
Yeah, but assuming that it's still covered in the original hair.
They also smell big hair.
Right. Well,
it says kids, so it might have been, the babies have less.
But still, they're furry animals. They're not. I mean, how hairy could Esav have been? Right. I mean, it's pretty bad.
I just had
They're pretty
goats
hairy. They're
at
hairy
Noah's
hands.
Ark a couple weeks ago,
Right.
and my granddaughter made me feed those goats for half an hour. They are thick and hairy, even the smaller.
Right. Even the smaller ones. So the Sforno is so bothered by this question. Yeah. And I'm bringing this out because we're going to show you how the way the commentaries, the way that they move within the text because of this. This Sforno suggests that when it says Yitzchak's eyes were blind, it means that his other senses were weakened as well.
Which is
It's actually the opposite.
Yeah.
It's usually the
I know,
Yeah.
I understand, but he's suggesting, right? Because there would go Braille, if because you assume that's where that extra sensitivity, because it just feels like a bunch of dots, right?
It
That's
always bothered me that he ought to be able to tell to walk. My husband had some relatives that were twins, and they decided to play a joke on the wife at night. And so the wrong twin walked up to her bedroom, and he didn't even open the door, and she said, "Cut it out, Johnny."
On the other side of the door?
right, by the
Right.
law.
Wow.
Yeah, they were identical
I-
twins.
You can hear by how people
They're
walk.
identical
Right.
twins.
Right.
And he didn't, it was dark, so blindness wouldn't, so this bothered me, because I thought, he had to have heard his footfalls. You know how people walk.
Well, it's on the
on
sand.
the
It's on a
ground,
sandy place. It's not on the creaking wooden floor. So maybe I don't know, but that's a good question. But the Seforno, because of this question, suggests that maybe Yitzchak's sense of touch was off, and so
And his hearing too.
maybe, and it seems so difficult to accept that because there doesn't seem to be any suggestion in the
Really,
text
his
like that.
hearing-
But he
His
keeps
hearing
asking,
is okay because he can make a distinction in the voice,
he
right?
obviously isn't fooled, because he keeps asking him over and over again.
Yeah, yeah.
So he seems to know right away.
Right,
what's that.
but he judges.
And how did the food get here so fast? And, he had a bunch of clues.
Right.
But he accepted it. In the end, he accepted it.
Yeah.
So he may have realized this is meant to be this way, and he knew who it was.
Well, we'll get to that. But that's what we're building towards here. Is that does Yitzchak really know? But at least according to these commentaries, it's pretty clear. I mean, the Seforno for him to suggest that Yitzchak's sense of touch was off, and therefore just feeling a hairiness was enough without being able to fully recognize it. I'm not sure where he's got to find some clue, which he doesn't give. He just says maybe Yaakov sensed a touch, and the Sforno doesn't seem to do that often, and just to insert that into the story, who said? But that's what he suggests.
Did Esav in any way, shape, or form, maybe because he was a hunter to protect his hands from the bow or whatever, did he wear gloves made from goat skins?
Possibly. I mean, you could maybe suggest that, except Yaakov is feeling for the day Esav. Right? It seems like he's the hands of Esav. So it sounds like...
But if he always wore gloves, if he always wore...
Right, and also from the argument that Yaakov makes, it's how can I do it? My hands are all smooth and his hands are hairy, and that seems to be. But you could if you wanted to try to read it that way. And there are those who suggest that this was that he wore the hunting clothing of Esav in order so that the whole cloak would give off. Maybe that's what helped with the smell. I don't know. Okay.
So then my other
The
question
garments.
was, maybe when you talk about that he was so hairy, that's not usual, but I'm wondering if that could be in the nature of a birth defect. That Esav was somehow born very different from what other people are, and that could have had something to do with the fact that he was so maladjusted.
No, absolutely. In fact, there's a disease that causes people to be covered completely in hair. And so, Ripley's, believe it or not, makes a really big deal about it. But it's because it's Barnum and Bailey. They were big into this stuff. Trying to P.T. Barnum, right? He was looking for these kinds of people, so that's how these people became famous. But there are all kinds of diseases, including those that make people cover them in hair, almost like an animal. So it could be. It certainly would fit with. Hopefully, we'll get to it to a certain extent. It does fit with the Kabbalistic perspective, which is that the Esav is the perversion of the judgments and the gevuros and the strengths, and severity is really the word. And hair is associated with judgment. That is why the Levites, who are the representation of judgment, had to have all their hair removed in order to sweeten those judgments, and that's why children don't get boys don't get a haircut till a certain age, and things that all the stuff associated with hair is because hair is the channel for judgment in the world, and that's where Shimshon gets his strength from the hair.
But is that so only for men with hair?
No, hair is always
So women's hair judgment?
It's a channel for severity. You see, judgment, it's not good or bad, right? Because Avraham is the channel for kindness. Yitzchak is the channel for severity. And they're both the good kindness and the good severity. It's Yishmael and Esav who are the perversion of the kindness and the severity. So the hair is a manifestation of the being a channel of severity, and that's why Esav is covered in hair, because he represents that concept. What?
And why the other is so smooth.
Right, and that's why the other. Although Yaakov is technically balanced, but that's just the way that it comes out. Is that all the negativity channeled through Esav creates this overwhelming being of severity and judgment, and that's, if you go through all of the Torah, whenever you have any laws that apply to hair, any restrictions that apply, all of these are related to the concept that hair is a representation of severity. That's or channels of bringing severity into the world, and that's a whole. You give a whole series of classes just on everywhere in Tanakh that hair appears and the symbolism behind it.
Why would men be required to have payas then?
So actually, there's the hair of the head and there's the hair of the face. So the hair of the face, which starts from the side of the head downward, is actually super kindness, like beyond super kindness. That's like the 13 attributes of mercy are represented by the hair of the beard, and the different sections where the beard grows represents a different balancing of those mercies. All, again, images up in heaven, and all the rules and the laws of the beard in the whole Torah are going to be representations or are going to be correlations or symbolisms reflecting those channels of mercy. Again, it's a very, very complicated subject, but that's why the people who do live by a more Kabbalistic approach, say the Hasidim, you'll notice that the men get a 000 haircut in their head. They shave their heads everywhere except the payas, and the payas, some of them never ever cut. And they never cut the beard because they're cutting away all the channels for severity and allowing a abundance of flow in the kindness. At least that's what it Kabbalistically represents in theory. But That's why they do it? I mean, do they know that's why they do it? The ones that know. But no, not everyone who does everything knows why they're doing it. But you'll find that many of the laws, the way they apply, like if you're supposed to get a haircut, it should be done on Friday morning, but not Friday afternoon. All these times when the judgments are meant to be fixed, but Shabbos afternoon, it's already a time when there's no judgment, so that's why the law is you don't get a haircut Friday afternoon. So the simple pshat is because in case you get stuck and end up being late for Shabbos, but there's always a deeper meaning behind it, because this is a haircut is actually a holy process, and that's why you find holy haircuts in the Torah. Okay, so the back to our subject. What?
Holy haircut, Batman.
So, the Kli Yakar, however, completely disagrees with the Sforno. The Kli Yakar, again, the Sforno is of the opinion that Yitzchak was somehow unable to fully touch and feel, and that's why the Kli Yakar disagrees. He asks the following question. It seems from the verses that Yitzchak had a contradiction. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, and the hands are the hands of Esav. And then the next verse says, but he couldn't recognize him because his hands were the hands of Esav, meaning that the hands of Esav won out. So the Kli Yakar wants to suggest that in fact, Esav's hands were as hairy as that of a goat skin. That's how bad it was. And Yitzchak was so convinced because he felt you can fake a voice, you can change a voice. But he was so accustomed to touching Esav's hands all the time that he knew them perfectly, that there isn't a chance that anyone could manufacture any kind of fake skin that would perfectly fit with the feeling of Esav's hands. And he was right. There's no way in the world that Yaakov would have known the exact texture of the feel of his brother's hand. Except it didn't take into account that Esav's mother would. And that's why he was fooled, says the Klei Yakar, because he assumed Esav had such distinct hands, and there was something that he's arguing the contrary. Yitzchak had such a perfect feel for the touch that he was, and that's how he walked, that's how he functioned with the touch, that he could tell, instead of the footfalls, he could tell anything by the way that it felt. And it was only because Rivka had just as much, I guess you could say, the advantage that a father would have to feel without sight, to feel his child, is something that the mother would have even without that advantage of losing one sense. And so she was able to prepare those skins in a way where she felt it does feel like Esav's hands, and she put them on Yaakov.
Well, if Esav was Yaakov's favorite, perhaps because Esav needed more help, was Yitzhak's favorite because Esav needed more help, then as a parent, and you deal with different kids with different strengths and weaknesses, you always hold out the hope that that child is going to grow, mature, right? Okay. So, if you always had that hope that Esav would be better, would start to speak nicer, would become more refined and everything, so when he hears the voice of Jacob, and he feels the hands, maybe it wasn't so much that the hands felt exactly like Esav's hands, but that hope of, oh, my son has finally gotten it. He finally gets it. Here, he's finally speaking nicely. And yes, his hands are hairy. It must be him.
I can definitely see that pshat. You'd have to take into account that Esav goes bad, as we're told by our sages, on his 15th birthday, is when he committed his first murder. He was 15 when he committed his first murder. And he, at this point, is 63. So,
Really?
yeah. So he's been close to 50 years of behaving in a certain way. So taking that into account, if possible, I still would hear that's I think a fair pshat to suggest that Yitzchak is always trying to read better. A better view into the way Esav talks to him. And maybe here maybe he was trying to read more into it, or maybe he felt that maybe he himself is reading too much into it. Right? So, in other words, he said maybe Esav isn't being that polite, I'm just hearing it better than I should.
This gets you off track, but you're talking about it's a long time developing. It's shocking to me every time I read this, what Rivka did to her husband. There's no indication anywhere along the way that she was such a trickster and would do something like that.
Right. She's the mastermind behind this.
Action,
right. Absolutely.
Rabbi Worch, I recently heard this from one of my family members that Esau was supposed to die. And there was an argument between Hashem and Melech Moabed that would say Esau is supposed to die and give it to me. And Hashem said, I'll make a deal with you. And the deal was, he said, I'm going to tell you from whom the Mashiach is going to come. And it's going to be a red person. Melech Moabed took Esau to be the father of Mashiach. But we know it was King David, right?
Right.
So, in my view, Eshab knew that his son did not have a chance. He's got the raw deal because of him. And he was very lenient towards him, and he knew that he has a lot of potential and was hoping that he would reach his potential.
But I think that fits in with what everyone is saying, including the commentaries. I don't know about this midrash that says that there was some confusion between Esav and David. We know later Shmuel doesn't think David's going to be king because it reminds him of Esav. But to say the other way, that Esav was originally confused as possibly being David, that's a turn on that midrash. But that's very possible. So comes along the Ibn Ezra. The Ibn Ezra asks a lot of what he calls difficult questions on this parsha. And because of all the questions, the Ibn Ezra concludes as follows. He says, it seems clear to me that Yitzchak is simply in doubt. Hakol kol Yaakov. If I follow the voice, it's Yaakov. Vayidayim yudei Esav. And if I follow the hands, it's the hands of Esav. Says the Ibn Ezra that Yitzchak said, but either way, it's my son, so he can have the blessing. It's a very disappointing take on the parsha, as if Yitzchak was called in Esav and says, "Could you bring me the food? I'll bless you." But he hadn't been sold on it has to be Esav. It was just one of his sons is going to get his blessing. So if someone else came, but as long as it's a son, so you know what, you can have the blessing too.
As long as he's got the food.
Right, almost like that. So this is a difficult Ibn Ezra, because these blessings are a much bigger deal than just, you know what, Esav's not here. Yeah, it might be Yaakov. Okay, so I did my best. I checked out. The hands check out. If it's Yaakov, you can have the blessing. It's very difficult. Very difficult.
Maybe he's a little bit senile.
Right, but we don't want to go there. Right. So it's interesting because the Ksab Sofer, another one of the commentaries, tries to fix this Ibn Ezra. And he says that this is all God's doing. Because you might ask, what is wrong with Yaakov? In terms, his mother gave him instructions. Pretend to be Esav. So you walk in and you say, "Hey, Dad, your food's here. It's getting cold. You better eat it." That's what he should have said. Instead, he says, "Please, Father, can I ask you? Could you sit up? Can I get you a pillow?" That's not the way Esav. What is he? Is he a bad actor? Is that the problem? It doesn't seem like it. If he needed to say things, he's so brilliant in the way that he doesn't tell a single lie in the whole story, even though he's lying through his teeth. But there's no technical lies. He says, "Are you Esav? Are you really Esav?" And he says, "I am." He asks, "Who are you?" "I am," but he doesn't say Ani Esav. He says Anochi Esav. Anochi technically is I am who I am, Esav. So
he says he's Esav.
No, he said I am who I am, Esav. Because he didn't say Ani. Ani means I am, followed by whatever the next word is. So technically, as I was saying, the point is technically it's not a lie. Absolutely. But the point is that he's so clever that he avoids using any technical lies. You would think that should mean, at least in terms of his acting, he should have enough sense to use a little harshness with his father to be a little more convincing. On the contrary, I'm arguing he was a much better liar than this.
He had enough sense to tell Rachel, "You better have some simanim."
Right. Yeah, he's clever enough to understand this. So the Ksav Sofer says that, on the contrary, Yaakov understood that if he convinces his father that he is Yaakov, his father, if he allows his father to know it's Yaakov, then he won't get the blessings. His father will say the blessings go to Esav. But if he fully convinces his father that the brachas are that he is Esav, then the blessings will go to Esav regardless of him being there. That's a very interesting explanation. If Yitzchak would think that he is Esav, then the blessings would actually transfer to Esav through Yaakov. Says the Ksav Sofer that what the Ibn Ezra means is that it has to be that Yitzchak is in a state of doubt, and that state of doubt therefore doesn't allow him to channel it towards Yaakov or Esav, but towards whoever is standing before him, and that's why Yaakov gets the brachas. All that is just within the realm of the pshat. The simple trying to understand the story.
So how does that explain the fact that Yaakov didn't speak harshly to his father?
Right, because he needed to keep the doubt. So he's got to present one side.
Is it better for him to think a little more that it's Yaakov? So then
No, because if he's convinced it's Yaakov, then he'll refuse to give the brachas. If he's convinced it's Esav, then the brachas will just travel through him straight to Esav, wherever he is. So that state of doubt, says the Ksav Sofer, is what allows the blessings to come to him. And Yaakov knows that, and so he needs to create this perfect balance of doubt in Yitzchak in order to get the brachas.
See, I thought it was probably that he needed to still have kibbud av. Like even though he was doing this bit of trickery, he felt, and it was.
So then we're back to what Kathy was arguing before. Like, I'd rather my kid insult me than trick me. Right? I mean, which is the greater honor?
He was doing kibbud aim with the trickery and kibbud av with the way he presented himself.
Okay, but you're endangering one for the sake of the other.
And why would Yitzchak give a bracha if he wasn't out, considering the significance of these brachas?
Right, well, that's where you go back to the Ibn Ezra's argument, which is that he says, in the worst, it's not like I gave the blessing to a stranger, it's the wrong son. And he did win out with the hands argument, because it really did feel like Esav. But it was just that doubt of being somewhat unsure, which allows the blessings to stay with Yaakov. That's the Ksav Sofer. Okay. Now, that's in the world of Pshat. Let's move into the world of Drush. So our sages tell us, and I'm sure you've heard this Midrash before, fascinating Midrash. The Midrash says that there were no philosophers in the world as great as Bilam and Avnimus the Gardi, Avnimus the tailor. He was apparently the greatest philosopher of all time. I have yet to see his name in any bibliography. What?
Sounds like the 2,000-year-old man.
Right. So the Gemara tells us all the nations of the world came to Avnimus Agardi and said to him, "How do we beat the Jews? We need a solution, a final one to overcome the Jews. What can we do?"
What year is it supposed to be?
So it doesn't tell us, but sometime during the Talmudic age. There was this guy called Avnimus Agardi, and again, you can search all the libraries. I don't think you'll find his name mentioned. So, but the Medrash says he was the greatest philosopher. Him and Bilam were the greatest philosophers of all time. Okay, so it says, he said to them, "Here's your very simple test. Go to the schools and to the shuls. If you hear the sounds of small children and their voices chirping in Torah, you will never overcome the Jewish people. For their father gave them the promise of Hakol Kol Yaakov, the voice is the voice of Yaakov. As long as the voice is the voice of Yaakov, the hands of Esav will not be the hands of Esav. But if the voice of Yaakov imlav, meaning if you go to the schools and the shuls and you don't hear the sounds of Torah study, then Hayidayim Yidei Esav, that's when the hands of Esav gain power. In other words, much like Rivka's prophecy at the beginning of the parsha, where she's told the La'om Yamatz, when one is up, the other one is down, there will constantly be a struggle between Yaakov and Esav. Avnimus Agardi says, I'll tell you, it's the way to measure it. Go to the shuls. If you hear the sound of Torah, specifically the school children, if you hear the sounds of school children chirping, is the term he uses, their Torah study, then you have no chance against them. And there's many stories that are explained this way. This is why Haman comes in and he sees Mordechai studying Torah with the children, and that's why that's the real secret for the miracle. It wasn't Mordechai or Esther, it was the school children studying their Torah, and that's why there's a custom amongst the Jewish people, a beautiful custom, that they have a yeshivas Mordechai HaTzadik, which is that everyone stops for an hour or so in the middle of Purim Day, and all the children come into all the shuls. A very common custom, especially in the United States, that all the kids come into the shul for an hour and they study Torah to remember that the true source for the miracle of Purim was the Torah study of children. Anyway, but that's what he says. So the Medrash seems to take this statement of Yitzchak a completely different way. Not like we've been reading, which is that this was some kind of doubt. The voice is the voice of Yaakov, the hands are the hands of Esav, but rather the Medrash understands this as a statement, either the voice is the voice of Yaakov, or the hands will be the hands of Esav. And then anytime we see the overpowering of the hands of Esav, that means that we as a people have failed to produce and provide the voice of Yaakov.
It's pretty much like the first one, the first interpretation.
The first one is that
if the hands or if the voice is the voice of Jacob, Yaakov, then
but we're not talking about Yaakov or Esav. We're talking about the future, right? Meaning that one.
So one is saying literally, and the other is saying in the future.
Right. So the Matnas Kahuna, who's bothered by this, he says, well, this isn't part of the blessings. If this would appear in the blessing, which by the way it does appear in the blessings later, when Esav says some blessing, can't you give me some blessing? He says, yeah, when your brother falls, when he falters in his mission, then you'll have the power to overcome him. But the Medrash isn't reading it into that verse. Medrash is reading it into Yitzchak's doubt as to who the son is, and we're reading in that. So the Matnas Kahuna says that besides for Yitzchak testing to see which son it was, there was also a prophecy on his part. The words were coming out of his mouth, which would be a prophecy for all time. That as long as there was the voice of Yaakov, there would be the hands of Esav. The only problem is, as the Kli Yakar says, how do you know which one is which? Why? Yitzchak says the voice is the voice of Yaakov, and the hands are the hands of Esav. How do you know that either it's the voice of Yaakov, or, and if not, then it's the hands of Esav? Maybe Yitzchak meant the other way, that the hands of Esav shall have power, and if they don't, then the voice of Yaakov will have power. How do you know which one is which? So the Kli Yakar says, a very simple, logical argument. He says that when he was feeling the hands, the first statement he should have said was, the hands do feel like Esav, but the voice is the voice of Yaakov. Why does he say first, the voice is the voice of Yaakov, then the hands are the hands of Esav? So the Kli Yakar says that's to refer to the prophecy that the default is that the voice is the voice of Yaakov, and that's the one which is unbeatable. Only then, if that goes away, then come the hands of Esav, because the voice of Yaakov was written first. But the Rosh, and now this is very important before we go into the next level, the Rosh says, and you can see this in the text, that there is a slight misspelling in the verse. If you look at verse 23, verse 22, Chav Gimel, and Yaakov approached Yitzchak his father, and he felt him, Vayomer, and he said, Hakol, Kol Yaakov. So the word kol is spelled differently in the two places. The ha means, is it that? Right, this is on page 136, it's 5 lines from the bottom. Hakol, the first kol, voice, is spelled without a vav in the middle, while the second kol is spelled with a vav, making the first word not kol, but kal. So the Rosh explains that the verse is Hakal Kol Yaakov. When the voice of Yaakov falters, kal meaning light or failure or fall, when the voice of Yaakov falters, then Hayadayim Ide Esav. Which is very interesting, because that means that there actually isn't the positive in the verse, according to the Rosh. It's only the negative. Almost as if Yitzchak is saying to Yaakov, you've come here with your voice, and your voice is refined. I want you to know that if you would have failed in your voice, then the hands of Esau would have had power. It's almost a warning. Like, you should know that you did the right thing by using your voice properly. Because if you would have messed up with your voice and you would have come in as Esau, then you would have lost the voice of Yaakov. Because our power is the power of the voice. And there's a whole bunch of midrashim, we don't have time to list them all, but there's many midrashim that actually build on this, that the power of the Jewish people is the kol, the voice of Yaakov. Torah and tefillah, that is our power, more than the yadayim. That's why Yaakov gets so upset with Shimon and Levi, who took klei chamas, mecheroseim. You stole. That's not our way. Our way isn't to take sword up in hand. Our voice is to raise our way is to raise our voices to God. Now, obviously, you need. God says, grab your soldiers and go to war with Amalek. But you still have to have the army go out and fight. But the real battle is Moshe Rabbeinu with his hands in the air for prayer. And when his hands came down, the Jewish people would lose. So you need an army, but the real power is powered by the voice of Yaakov.
So is this both literal and, for this time and for the future?
That's the way the Matnas Kahuna is saying. That Yitzchak seems to say it in a way that he's speaking in one way, but through him is being channeled a prophecy of what would happen in the future.
Which makes sense with what you have said, what the steps our forefathers have taken, foreshadow what will happen in the future.
That's what we talked about, Shlach Lecha, that everything that's happening here will be, including, the whole process of the relationship between Yaakov and Esau is in fact the story of the Jewish people, which maybe if we have time we'll get to it. But now that we've built on this drush and we have this explanation that the Kol Yaakov is referring to the general state of Yaakov, and we've noticed that the first call is missing a vav, this allows us a channel to know a whole new secret, and we're moving into a new level of what's happening in this parsha. So this Torah comes from the Megala Amukas of Nelson Natan Shapiro, who Megala Amukas literally translates as the one who reveals the depths. So when he, in his book, everything that he says is a secret revealed. So I'll tell you what he says. I'm not sure if we can understand everything he says, but just to understand that here we have, in the same verses, where we're debating, that the father, he felt the hands, he felt that this was the voice, did he lose this kind of sense? In that same verse that's discussing all this pshat, there's a whole deeper level that we would never see unless those with vision showed it to us. And this is what he says. It all goes back to the Garden of Eden. Everything always goes back to the Garden of Eden. And the sin of the Garden of Eden had many layers. What was the first step in the sin, the Garden of Eden? The first step.
Adam didn't give Hashem's instructions.
Right. But that was a separate sin. That was the beginning of the sin. That's what led to the sin.
Look with the eyes.
She looked with the eyes. The first thing that in the actual process was she saw the tree that it was good. And we know that Adam Arishon ruined the world, broke the world. And it's our job, we as the Jewish people, it's our job as the people meant to fix the world. That's our task, along with the rest of the world, but we're the guides. This process of fixing it begins with Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, starting with Avraham's his recognition that there is a God, and there's a creator. Says the Megala Amukos that the first step, the vision, the sight of the tree, the fixing of that begins with Yitzchak's blindness. Yitzchak and Rivka, the next level, after Avraham and Sarah, the next level of the fixing of the original sin, begins with Yitzchak's blindness to undo, to fix, to correct the blemish of the inappropriate looking into the tree. And so Yitzchak was therefore supposed to maintain the kedusha and sanctity and fulfill his purpose without the sight. What's the word? What do you use to see? Ayin, the eye. Ayin is spelled kuf. Ayin is gematria. Ayin, 70, Yud, Nun is 10 and 50. 70, 10, and 50 is 130. That's kuf lamed. Kuf lamed is 100. That's the cow. Now, we know...
That's how many years Adam Harishon repented.
Right. We know that Adam Harishon separates from his wife for 130 years. How do we know this? Because it says in the Torah that Adam knew his wife once more and had a child called Shes when he was 130 years old. The Torah tells us this. Now, Adam had, in year 1, he had 2 sons, Cain and Hevel. Then he has no children for 130 years. What was he doing those 130 years? So, we all know, we've quoted this before, but say it again, that he sat in the Nile River. Sat in the Nile, yes. For 130 years, not procreating. And that not procreating of Adam Harishon, with all the power and the souls that he contained, actually produced emissions which would produce the aspects of evil in the world. This is a whole complicated discussion which we're not going to get into, but we saw this in the Gemara, that the concepts of demons and Liliths and spirits and all these other forces for negativity are all as a result of Adam Harishon's failure in those 130 years. And that's the Kuf Lamed, the 130. The same word which is Gematria Ayin, the eye, which is 130. This is why the wives of Esav, who by the way are the demonesses, without getting into the complexities of that, are producing an evil ruach, an evil spirit, to Yitzchak and Rivka, and they say that the smoke of their all the stuff that they were burning blinded Yitzchak, because batipakachna einei shnehem, because what happened was when they sinned, in the first thing that happened to them as soon as they ate was their eyes were opened. And what it actually means is that their eyes were closed. Right? It means they went blind to seeing things the way they're supposed to be. For the first time, they saw good as evil and evil as good. And that's all representative of the smoke being produced by these demonesses, the wives of Esav, who are now stopping Yitzchak from being able to perceive, and he actually goes blind.
And that's why Rivka says her life is worthless.
Katzti b'chaye, right? I can't shoot. They couldn't tolerate, because all those forces were the forces trying to battle Yitzchak and Rivka's attempt, and this is going to keep getting fixed. Yaakov has to work through this until notice ayin is only one eye, which is 130. What's two? We'll get to the second eye in a second. But that's why Yaakov's vision of the ultimate perfection of the world is in the form of a ladder spelled Samach Lamed Mem, 60, 30, 40, is 130. Because Sulam is also 130. That same 130, which is the eye, which is the Kuf Lamed, which is the voice of Yaakov, all that is in the ladder. And I mean, they're all represented by the same concept. Now, when Hashem approaches Adam and says, Hamin ha'etz, did you really eat from the tree? And we know that Hamin is a reference to Haman, who is a grandson of Esav, who is, again, trying to bring darkness back into the world. But let's leave the Purim story out of this for now. Hamin ha'etz, those two words, those 6 letters, Hamin is 95, ha'etz is 175, which is 260. That's 2 times ayin. Hamina eitz means that you've now blemished the eye and your eyes are now open, both eyes, and you're seeing what's good as evil and what's evil as good. And so Yitzchak is trying to undo this. That's why he gives Yaakov 10 blessings, because there were 10 curses given to Adam. In fact, you'll notice maybe if you haven't noticed it before, you'll notice it next time. When you make the bracha, Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam, hamotzi lechem min haaretz, that blessing has 10 words. Why? Because the verse that the blessing gives Yitzchak gives Yaakov, which is V'yitan lecha ha'elokim mitala shamayim u'mishmanei haaretz v'rov dagan v'tirosh, the first verse, also has, counted yourself, you'll see, has 10 words. Because this whole process is to try to undo the sin, the original sin. But who initiated the original sin?
The snake.
Oh, this is the name, the Nachash.
No, Nachash is an animal. He can't sin.
So, Chava.
Chava. He says that's why this has to happen through Rivka. It's specifically the mother who's initiating this, the mother there realizing that this is the opportunity to use the confusion, the blindness, the mixture of good and evil, the evil and good, the mixture of Yaakov and Esav, the confusion that Yitzchak has as to who is the good and who is the bad, by her taking away the potential for Yitzchak to confuse good for bad and inserting the good in its place is the undoing of the original sin which came through eating, which is why it has to happen again through eating, that instead of eating of the negativity of Esav and being drawn into being fooled into what's good and what's evil, instead eat that food. And what does he smell when Yaakov walks in? He smells Gan Eden, because they're back in Gan Eden. They're back in Gan Eden. This time he's eating the food, and she has removed the fruit of the Eitz Hadas, of the confusion of good and evil, and instead brought, so to speak, the Eitz HaChaim of good. And that's why it says, she uses the words, V'ata b'ni, and now my son, Shema b'koli. Hear my voice. Shema b'koli. You know what the first time that expression appears? It says to Adam, Ki shamata l'kol ishtecha, because you heard, it's the same expression, you heard the voice of your wife. Meaning that this time, Rivka has to undo that expression, those words that she did, and bring it back to the right place. And that's why it says, Kol hashtomer elecha Sarah shema b'kola. It has that same expression because they were also trying to fix that. Avram listening to Sarah and doing the right thing, which is to remove the evil out of the house, was that first time. And this time it works through a different process. This time it's through blindness it's a deeper immersion into the Garden of Eden, again, to remove that. And just to add one little piece to this, you'll notice that Yaakov, this is much later in the Torah, Yaakov, when he is 130 years old, is when he goes down to Egypt, out of the Nile, which is when Adam comes to have Sheis. Yaakov goes down to Egypt when he is 130. And there they will stay in Egypt. How long were they in Egypt? 210. How old was Moshe when they left? 80. Which means how long were they in Egypt until the Savior could be born?
130.
There were 130 years in Egypt of suffering. And then, Vatera also, she saw him. What does the Torah tell us? That Yocheved saw the baby. Vater also, Kitov. Right? What does it say, Kitov? That he was good. What does that mean? Because you had the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And after 130 years in Egypt of all that fixing, Vater also Kitov, there was finally a child born who can step out of the confusion of good and evil. He was the greatest prophet of all time, who could go up and live with the angels for 40 days and 40 nights without eating, who was the perfection, the greatest fulfillment that man could possibly fulfill after 130 years. So it's interesting that Yaakov, when he stands before Paro, at the age of 130, which is about to begin the process of 130, Paro says to him, you look a lot older than 130. He says, no, my life has been ma'at v'ra'im, terrible and bitter. And everyone says, they even say Yaakov was punished for that. He shouldn't have said that. So why did he say it? He's saying it because he thought power was referring to spiritually speaking. He's asking, why do you look so bad? He's like, because I just spent 130 years trying to fix the blemishes of Adam and Chava. And now, his last 17 years, because he lives to 147, his last 17 years, he was done with his task. Tov, Tesvav Beis, is 17. So Yaakov has his 130 years, then he has Tov, that's why he lives to 147. The whole Torah can be read, the same words, the same stories, the same terms and expressions, the Kol Yaakov, which in the realm of Pshat is a debate over how hairy were Esav's hands, is also a Hakal, the Kuf Lamed, is the voice of Yaakov. That's how things are going to be fixed through the 130, because he is Adam Arishon after 130 coming back. That's when Yocheved is 130 when she gives birth to Moshe, like Chava is 130, and 130 is Ayin, which is the eye. Hamina Eitz is 260 because that's two eyes. Because both their eyes are open, and that's the blindness of Yitzchak. It all reads into the same reading of the Parsha. Because as much as these are great people, these are the prophets, these are our forefathers, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and what they're doing is happening in this world, and happening in the world of Midrash, and happening in the world of Sod. May we merit a little bit of insight, and may we take from this inspiration, both in terms of the power of the voice of Yaakov, and the power of the holiness of the eyes, and may we merit to do our part in the fixing of the world by separating good from evil.